To kick things off, really appreciate everyone joining us here today for our first episode of Planet Earthly, where we're going to be doing a deep dive into regenerative farming. And so really excited to have with us today two of our advisors. So Dr. PJ Stevenson, who's the chair of the IUCN SEC Species Monitoring Specialist Group at the University of Lausanne, Dr. Cornelia Rumpel, PhD Research Director at CNRS, who's our soil advisor, and PJ is our biodiversity advisor, and also Philippe, who's co-founder at Climate Farmers, who are one of our amazing project partners. And we thought we'd just kick things off with a kind of a quick overview of regenerative farming. I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Olivia, who is our research fellow at Earthly. Olivia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ollie. So yeah, I'd like to introduce the focused nature-based solution for us today, which is regenerative farming or regenerative agriculture. And I wanted to start by sharing some insights into the potential impact that a transition to regenerative farming could have on climate, biodiversity, and people, because these are three pillars in the way that Earthly thinks about the impact of nature-based solutions. So on the next slide, you'll see some pretty exciting statistics around these three areas. So when it comes to climate mitigation, there's a huge opportunity to sequester carbon and to capture carbon in the soil and potentially store it in deeper layers over time. So per hectare, up to 33 tons of carbon could be removed. And this estimate varies depending on the practice. So for example, those practices involving trees like agroforestry or silvopasture may capture more carbon per hectare than practices focused on the way soil is manipulated. But annually, this could add up to the removal of between 0.79 to 1.54 gigatons of carbon from the atmosphere. So together, all nature-based solutions across protection, so forests, regenerative management, like regenerative farming, and restoration could deliver 10 gigatons annually every year up to 2030. So switching to regenerative agriculture would make up a significant part of that, and it would be just under a sixth of that potential. So just speaking to biodiversity, transitioning to regenerative agriculture could also have a huge impact here. The global area of agricultural land today is around 5 billion hectares. So that's 38% of the global surface on land. And this means that the positive impacts of regenerative farming could improve biodiversity at a huge scale if biodiversity is taken into consideration. And out of that 5 billion hectares, about a third is cropland, while 2/3 is more meadows and pastures for grazing livestock. So it would require different types of regenerative farming practices to actually restore soil health and biodiversity in those different areas. But importantly, biodiversity is highly impacted by how much land is restored or set aside, which our biodiversity advisor, PJ, will touch on later. And then when it comes to species, so animals, plants, fungi, invertebrates, over 17,000 are threatened by today's agriculture. But by factoring in biodiversity, we could reduce pressure on many of these species. In particular, this affects animals in the soil, so the soil microbiome, including bacteria and fungi, as well as earthworms and other invertebrates. But it would also affect biodiversity above ground. So that includes birds, pollinators like bees, and also native plant species that can be chosen, such as on agroforestry farms. And then when it comes to social impact, the potential for regenerative farming is really far-reaching. In some work that we carried out with researchers from the UK, Europe, and Australia, we found really strong positive evidence for impacts on 7 of the global sustainable development goals, including poverty, hunger, gender equality, decent work, and responsible consumption. And this really translates into impacts on food and water quality availability, both locally and at a global scale, and thinking about food security more widely as global demand increases and potentially yields currently are dwindling. And regenerative farming also means reducing and reversing soil erosion and degradation, which results in the loss of farmland and ultimately loss of jobs for farmers, while it can also help them adapt to climate change and secure livelihoods in the long term, which is really important in places where huge portions of the population work on the land. So regenerative agriculture feeds into many areas of local and global concern, and has the potential to help reverse many of the challenges we face. If we move briefly onto the next slide, as I said, Earthly tries to take a holistic approach, considering the climate, biodiversity, and social impact of all the nature-based solutions that we work with.
Thank you, Olivia. Appreciate the overview. And moving on to Cornelia, who is going to dig into a bit more detail on regenerative agriculture and soil health. Cornelia, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Cornelia Rampel. I'm Research Director at CNRS, and I work for the Institute of Ecology and Environmental Sciences in Paris. So I will talk a bit about the regenerative agriculture and the soil health. As you know, we have a dramatic population growth globally. And this population growth puts us in a very bad situation, because we have an increasing per capita consumption, and we need to produce all these food and produce. And so this points us to the limits of land. So the arable land per capita is in fact decreasing very much with the ongoing population growth, and all this produce, food, and also the other commodities, fiber, and other things are produced actually from the soil, and puts this population growth puts a lot of pressure on the soil. We have 12 billion hectares of productive land, which ensure more than 99% of the human food production in terms of calories. So what we get from the ocean is not so much. And so we really, in terms of our food, rely on the soil. And the problem is that already 1/3 of the agricultural soils are degraded. So agricultural management, in fact, impacts the ecosystem services really dramatically. So we have mineral fertilization, tillage, irrigation, crop species, and grazing intensity that is different in the different agro ecosystems. And these agricultural practices impact the soil, and in particular the microorganisms living in the soil, and also the soil organic matter content. And these two parameters, so the microorganisms and organic matter in the soils, are in fact very important for the different functions that our soil provides us. So we have the soil has provisioning services in terms of food, fiber, water, clean water, energy, biodiversity. The biodiversity of soil is huge. The microbial biodiversity, we don't even know all the organisms in the soil, but they are really heavily affected by the agricultural management, and the biodiversity of soil is declining. The soil has regulating services in terms of climate, environmental hazards, environmental quality, retention of pollutants, and biodiversity in general. And also the soil has supporting services in terms of primary production, decomposition, nutrient and water cycling, and also soil formation. The soil functioning and also the soil health are really intimately linked to the soil organic matter content, which determines the microbial functioning and the working together of the organic matter and the microorganisms. They actually result, in fact, in the ecosystem services that we can get from the soil. So, and when we have this intensive land management with the heavy machinery and bare soil, then actually all these services are affected, and this is mainly related to the soil organic matter loss. Next, please. When we lose soil organic matter, then we have greenhouse gas emissions in forms of CO2 and also other greenhouse gases. We have soil erosion risk when the organic matter content is low. We have reduced biodiversity. We have increased vulnerability against extreme events, because when the organic matter of the soil is low, then the water infiltrability is lower. we have less nutritious food, and we also have pollution risks in form, for example, of dust storms or soil loss, and with high nitrogen and phosphorus contents, for example. So when we have sustainable agroecological practices, we have the soil that is covered. Soil organic matter is increasing due to the higher biodiversity and the better plant production. So we have soil protection, diversity at all levels, increased resilience, nutritious food, and also reduced pollution risk. And these ecosystems can take up CO2 and therefore also fight against the increasing CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. And the positive effects on soil organic matter and soil health may be achieved by rethinking our agricultural systems. Next. So the sustainable agroecological practices that we need to introduce to increase the soil organic matter and soil health are very well known. So we know that when we keep the soil covered all the time, for example, by using cover crops, then we can increase soil organic matter and also soil health. We should use conservation agriculture with minimum tillage, reduced practices, reduced mineral fertilization. So this is best practices have to be applied. Agroforestry is a good way to increase the soil organic matter and also soil health. We should apply integrated soil fertility management, and also what is really very good is integrated crop livestock systems. One of our big problems is really the separation between the crop and the livestock systems. And to have an impact at scale, these practices need to be adopted by millions of farmers. And this is really one of the problems, because we have socioeconomic barriers for adoption. Farmers will maybe not adopt because they think it's too expensive and the yields will not be as high. So we have to demonstrate the benefits of these practices and also develop policies to encourage the adoption of these practices. And we have to overcome political barriers for adoption, such as bad governance or no support for change. So we have to convince policies and politicians with scientific evidence. Next, please. So the actions to regenerate soil organic carbon stocks and to restore the soil health of intensively used agro-ecosystems is, first of all, we have to stop the soil organic matter loss. We have to apply known sustainable practices. We have to monitor, to report and verify. And we can test new strategies. We should raise awareness, provide support, moral support, but also, of course, financial support to the farmers who need to change their practices. We have to coordinate policies, and also innovation may play a big role. So, and this, to implement these actions, we need, in fact, collaboration of multiple stakeholders. So governments should, of course, finance research, but also use, the research should develop improved soil management. This improved soil management should be developed together with the landowners. We need co-constructions, and we need also the businesses who have to provide some financial support to the landowners and to the research. And the whole need to be, the government, of course, need to provide the political framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cornelia. Really appreciate you taking us through a bit more detail, and would love to hand over to PJ to dig into a bit more detail on reflections on regenerative agriculture and the biodiversity focus. Over to you, PJ. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ollie. So as Ollie said at the beginning, I'm PJ Stevenson. I'm an independent conservation and sustainability consultant. I'm also chair of the IUCN SSC Species Monitoring Specialist Group, and a research fellow at the University of Lausanne. So I've spent quite a lot of time over the last few years, increasing amounts of time, working with companies in a variety of sectors to try and understand exactly how they can enhance their work on biodiversity. So that's included work with some agricultural commodities, especially in the context of Nespresso, a coffee company here in Switzerland, where I've helped develop the biodiversity elements of their regenerative agriculture strategy. And colleagues and I at IUCN have then used the lessons from working with different companies like Nespresso to develop generic guidelines for planning and monitoring corporate biodiversity performance. So based on my experiences to date across sectors, but especially with agriculture then, I just wanted to reflect a little bit on some of the issues with biodiversity in agriculture. So I think it's always worth reminding ourselves that we are in the middle of a biodiversity crisis. We are seeing unprecedented levels of species extinctions at the moment. And as you can see in the next element of this slide, agriculture is clearly the main threat to biodiversity on land. It's particularly important for forests, where agriculture is responsible for 80% of global deforestation. And it's a direct threat to the highest and most important threat to forest species. So the key question then is, can regenerative agriculture help reverse the trend we're seeing in biodiversity? So looking at this, I think, and Cornelia touched on this a bit, there are some challenges with regenerative agriculture. And one of them, in terms of biodiversity, I think there are three main issues here. The first is that there's not actually a common definition shared by everybody of what regenerative agriculture means and how it relates to climate agriculture, conservation agriculture, agroecology. But of the definitions that do exist, less than a quarter specifically include biodiversity. So that's the first issue. The second issue is then there's not common agreement on the different practices that are included in regenerative agriculture. And from the biodiversity perspective, a concern is some of those practices, such as crop rotation or no-tillage, don't actually have a direct or very significant impact on biodiversity anyway. And last but not least, there is an issue of monitoring. If we want to apply sustainable practices to improve biodiversity, we need to demonstrate that and we need to monitor that. But monitoring biodiversity in the agriculture context can be a challenge for a number of reasons. I'm going to just use coffee as a bit of a case study now. As I said, I have worked with coffee companies, but this is very much my own analysis of biodiversity in that context. So I think in terms of using coffee to look for solutions here, I think the first thing we need to do is define exactly what our environmental goals are. If we're going to use sustainable agriculture, whatever you want to call it, what do we actually want to see? What would success look like for biodiversity? And that, of course, will vary. I think with coffee in tropical forest landscapes, then we're often looking at conserving forests. For other commodities, it might be grasslands. It might be about conserving a sustainable source of fresh water. Or it might actually be also about conserving particular animals or plants. It might be birds, it might be insects, or even mammals. But I think in setting these goals, it's worth remembering a few key points. We need, as Cornelia touched on, to remember that soil is incredibly important. Something like 90% of terrestrial organisms spend part of their life cycle in soil, so we need to think of soil biodiversity. I also think there's a lot of tree planting around regenerative agriculture. A lot of that's for agroforestry, which is good in itself, but we also need to think more about planting trees for restoring habitats. In that context of habitats too, I mean, what you can do on a single farm can be limited. I think we always need to plan our biodiversity outcomes in the context of a broader landscape. And then Ollie, if just the last transitions here show, I think we also need to always think of protected areas as part of those landscapes, whether that's a bit of land set aside on a farm or a formal park or reserve. Those areas of habitat are also a key part of the picture here. Next. So the second issue then, if we've decided to use regenerative agriculture, is to decide what we want to achieve with that and which practices will help us get there. So my own analysis looking at the coffee sector, for example, suggests that the practices that focus most on reducing soil and water pollution or improving the size or quality of natural habitats are actually liable to have the biggest impact on biodiversity. You'll also get some results from things like agroforestry and other practices, but others will be less valuable for biodiversity, even if they have other values for carbon and other things. Next. And I think just to show you that one recent piece of research, for example, coming out of Denmark has shown there in different fields that they've shown that no-till agriculture is not as important as restoring set-aside land around those farms. So it's not just coffee, it's a number of commodities where it's really natural habitats that are key to the solution here. And then I think if you're going to use different practices, it's worthwhile thinking through, well, how do you expect them to impact biodiversity? So this is kind of understanding the process by kind of defining your theory of change, if you like. So if you're going to reduce if you're going to use natural pest control and organic fertilizers, which is a very common theme in regenerative agriculture, that means your output is going to be the reduced use of agrochemicals. But from that, you're going to expect to see reduced pollution in soil and water. But then the impact on biodiversity will be that you expect to see an improvement in the abundance and diversity of certain species, especially soil invertebrates, pollinators, and birds. If we look at, say, restoring natural habitats, that might be about planting native trees, but what we'll get out of that is more habitat and as a result, more species. And the last example I'll show here is again agroforestry. This is about putting more trees and shrubs on farms, but from that you'll see more farm habitats favorable to certain species, and then more of those species increasing in abundance. And the reason I mention this is basically thinking this through, it gives you a theory of change along which you can then monitor your progress. So my last point now is about then setting indicators. And if you thought through how the practices you use will help biodiversity, as this next graphic shows, you can set some simple indicators to measure that. So in the agroforestry example, you could easily count the number of people involved in agroforestry or trained to implement agroforestry, the number of trees planted. You could then measure the area that is under that tree cover, and also in some of the sites, look at bird abundance as well. Now, I'm not suggesting here that every farmer has to go out and count birds on their farm. The point here is, I think we need to think through clearly what biodiversity goal we're trying to achieve with this type of agriculture. But then I think it is important that the community as a whole, so farmers, agricultural companies, the academic community and NGOs do nonetheless on some farms applying these techniques, dig a bit deeper and monitor key indicators so that we really understand the impact we're having, which of course will give us a proof of concept, if you like, and also motivate hopefully more people to join in. So my last slide, basically my conclusion is just to remind everybody that protecting biodiversity and ensuring food security are actually part of the same agenda. These are not different topics, they're integral to each other. And as my last bit of text shows, I think honestly there is great potential for regenerative agriculture to have a positive impact on biodiversity if it's implemented in the right way and in the context of sustainable agricultural landscapes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, PJ, for sharing a presentation, another really insightful deck to go through. Over to you, Philippe.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, first off, thanks a lot to Cornelia and to PJ for setting, I would say, the perfect stage for us for why we're doing what we're doing. And would love to get some of the articles you were referencing, PJ, in terms of biodiversity. I think that's really interesting and relevant directly for our work. So would love to connect more there. So yeah, I think we touched upon it already. Agriculture is right now one of the biggest problems that we're facing in regards to climate change. It is basically related to almost all the areas where we reached our planetary boundaries. One of the key ones, of course, being 24% of all greenhouse gas emissions coming from agriculture. At the same time, we know about regenerative agriculture. It's nothing new. It's practices which have been practiced by tribes for thousands of years. But we have more and more research coming out that shows that it helps to reduce CO2 emissions. It stores CO2 in the ground. It helps with water shortages, the biodiversity crisis, the rising fertilizer costs at the moment. Fertilizer prices have risen 800% from last January to this year, January, which is insane for farmers. And regenerative agriculture can help with all of these things. So as mentioned, it helps on biodiversity building, it helps on capturing of carbon, it helps on erosion of reversing of erosion. But at the same time, it's not scaling. It's not what we're doing. When we started working with climate farmers on scaling regenerative agriculture in Europe, we estimated that there was between 1,000 and 2,000 regenerative farmers. In Europe, we have 16.5 million farmers in the European Union. So even if the number now is probably somewhere between 10 and 20,000, we're still talking about a fragment of the farming population. So what we did is we sat down and we wondered, why is it the case and how can we scale it? So there are two things which we think needs to happen. We need to reach about 10% of European farmland to be under regenerative management, because then we create the situation where any farmer can have another farmer which he or she can relate to, which is applying regenerative agriculture, which is a lot the problem that we have at the moment of so-called basically role model farms where other farmers could go. And it needs to be recognized that regenerative agriculture makes more sense economically as well, because in the end, farmers usually are with their back against the wall when it comes to finances. So we need to show that this is a profitable way forward and not just the way that is better for nature, for biodiversity, and for the climate, which should be good enough in itself, but we need the economical incentives as well. In order to get there, we see two main issues, which are knowledge and finance, both of which we're working on with climate farmers. On the knowledge side with our non-profit, the Climate Farmers Academy, and on the finance side with our for-profit. So on the knowledge side, this means on the one hand that we need to shift the mindset of farmers and that we need to create a mindset where they're working with nature and not against nature, basically. And we need to also enable them to learn from each other. So we need to provide them the context where they can exchange best practices with each other and where they can see what works in their specific own context. On the other side, we also need to provide payment instruments. We will dive deeper later into this, how we're doing this as climate farmers through, for example, our Carbon Plus credits. And at the same time, we also need to get this from society, and society needs to start recognizing and rewarding farmers for the work which they're doing if they're regenerating their soils. So in the last 2 years, we have been trying out a lot of different approaches, and we have been talking with a lot of farmers. We grew the largest regenerative agriculture farmer community in Europe. And based on all of these experiences, we come up with the following projects, which we think are the most impactful ones right now. The first one being farm enterprise analysis. So we're helping farmers to properly understand their context, to see also what will be the effects of climate change on their farm. And as a regard to that, what business models make sense for them in order to have a long-term future for the farm, also for the next generations. Afterwards, we integrate farmers into our community. This exchange between farmers seems to be a very essential thing. And it's crazy to see what a little WhatsApp group can sometimes do. And we were blown away by the feedback that we got from farmers and by the support and care that they give for each other. After that, we're also building a consultant network because there's a lot of consultants out there, but unfortunately the good ones very often are not very good at presenting themselves, and the bad ones are overly good in presenting themselves. So that's what we're trying to fix by having basically a farmer review system of our consultants. So other farmers can see which farmers the consultants already work with. And then we're working on a transition blueprint process with which we are mostly working with large-scale food corporates together in order to help them to transition their supply chain. So here again, we start at the context of the farmer. We think with the farmer and the different stakeholders, what they want to get out of life, basically. And from that, also out of their farm. What is the business context of the farm? What goes well? What goes not well? What is ecological context? What is the rainfall that they're having? What is the soil that they're having? And then we're creating a plan how a step-by-step transition of their farm conventional towards more regenerative practices can work while collecting data constantly and giving a feedback process to the farmer. Part of this is also the tech component of climate farmers, where we're on the one hand working with Wageningen University on doing modeling of the effects of the application of regenerative practices, and on the other hand, monitoring, where we basically, you could say, kind of check on the farmer if they're really implementing the practices that we discussed. And where we can see what's really happening on the land. This goes from seeing if they're tilling or not tilling to moving animals or growth of plants above soil. Through all of this, we are basically landing at the main project that we're working on, which is our regeneration credit or Carbon Plus credit. which on the one hand looks at the carbon that is captured in the soil, on the other hand at the water infiltration, which, for example, would have helped massively with the floods that we had in Germany and the Netherlands last summer due to eroded soils. And then also looking at biodiversity, where there are already quite a few interesting options out there. And I'm happy to exchange about this, PJ, in terms of people which are measuring basically through AI, the insect growth population, the bird growth population. There's even some private apps. I'm using BirdNet by now myself, which is very good in identifying birds. Can highly recommend that. And we're also starting to look at nutrient cycles, because there are studies that are starting to show that nutrients from regenerative agriculture in plants is higher than from conventional, which of course would again be a major factor in basically getting the transition done. Yeah, generally how we're working in climate farmers, well, we love to do collaborations like we're doing with Earthly. We love to look at identifying what are the things that need to happen in order to change, in order to scale, and then to make them happen, ideally in a partnership. And yeah, looking forward to hear more from the people in the audience as well. And if you want, then I also have a short video. If you are wondering, so this regenerative agriculture, what does this actually mean in practice? This is one of our farms in Portugal, Hera Luis, which is doing holistic management. So in nature, basically animals are usually very concentrated together because of predators. They're on one area of grass for one day, then they move to the next area, and they don't usually return for an area of 3 to 9 months. And if this happens, then the perfect symbiosis kicks in between cows and grass, where the cows nibble off the top of the grass, and then the grass kicks in and grows extra strong back, and through this storing major amounts of carbon in the soil. Unfortunately, this is rarely practiced because cows are, in the worst case, inside stables, or if they're outside, they're just let out, and then they're just on one area, moving very unnaturally, and thereby even doing more damage than healing. And if you're doing regenerative agriculture, then what you would be doing is holistic management. Francisco is a 700-hectare farmer in southern Portugal, which has a lot of issues with drought and rainfall. And through regenerative agriculture, we're trying to combat this. We're integrating agroforestry there. Some of the animals are running under trees. He's moving his animals basically once to twice a day. There's always a certain area where they're on, and then he sees how much they're grazing down. And then depending on that, they're moving basically over by just lifting the fence. So essentially, it's not even a lot of extra work by the farmer if it's done right, but it definitely helps with, well, regenerating the soil. And you also have happy animals which get their fresh food basically once or twice a day. You can kind of see it as going to the lunch table or to the dinner table. And then they will be returning to these fields again in 3 to 9 months. So if you're doing holistic management, what we're doing with Francisco at the moment is basically we set up together an annual plan where we looked at all of the fields and where the animals are moving when in terms of that planning. And if you have this, then you have a very high chance of increasing your biodiversity, storing carbon in the soil, and also producing some amazing meat and milk and cheese at the same way. I was vegetarian for 7 years myself. And then after visiting Francisco's farm, I decided this is meat that I can definitely stand behind eating. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Philly. Absolutely love what you're doing, and yeah, we're very very proud to be working with you. So I would just now love to move over to a Q&A, and we've just been sort of aggregating some of the questions that have been coming through. And I've got the first question that's come up here that I'd like to propose to you, PJ, which is what biodiversity will most benefit from regenerative farming?
Well, I think that it depends on two factors, essentially. I mean, first of all, it depends on what species and habitats were in that location beforehand. And I think even more importantly, it goes back to my point, it depends what regenerative agricultural practices you're using. So I think given that one of the common denominators is often soil management, I think we can honestly say probably across agricultural commodities and across countries and sites, soil biodiversity will probably be benefiting most. So, and again, I mean, people think of soil biodiversity, they usually just think of earthworms, but there are lots of other organisms living in the soil as well, from small plants to fungi to single cellular organisms, other types of worms, insects and insect larvae. So there's a lot there. And I think so that may not be everybody's classic idea of biodiversity, but I think that will definitely benefit. But I think, as I said, especially for those farms that also move on to the work to help with natural habitats, if there's any work at all to restore natural habitats, any work at all to set aside even a small bit of natural habitat that's on the farm, that's when I think you'll start to see other species profiting as well. And that's where you're more likely to see an increase in things like birds, possibly small mammals, frogs, lizards and things as well. So I think it's a typical scientific answer. It depends, but I think a lot of different species can if it's done properly.
Thank you for that, PJ. I have another question here around multi-stakeholder platforms, and specifically, how can multi-stakeholder platforms help to promote and adopt regenerative farming at scale? Philippe, do you want to perhaps take that one?
Sure, happily. Yeah, I mean, if we want to change basically the future of European agriculture, then we definitely need to operate on a systemic level, right? So it's not enough to just work with the farmers. There's just one component in there. Multinational food corporates is another one, and politics, of course, a big one as well. Especially in Europe, we're very much dominated by CAP. The Common Agricultural Policy is 440 billion euros, which are right now given out basically just on size of the farm, not looking really at what is happening on the farm. This is something that needs to change. And there's also feedback that we have been getting a lot from the farmers that we're working with. So what we organized last year was the first Climate Farming Congress, where we basically asked the 50 leading farmers from 16 different countries in Europe coming together, as well as some industry leaders, as well as some politicians. And the result of that was a manifesto that we wrote with everybody together for what we believe needs to happen, what we believe regenerative agriculture is, because it's also, as PJ correctly said, not really a defined term yet, which is very dangerous because it means that it can get easily hijacked by the, questionable people like Bayer talking suddenly about regenerative agriculture, where you're like, really? I'm not sure Monsanto and glyphosate and regenerative agriculture can be used together, but they're trying. So I think it's very important to establish their certain standards, and that's also where we need politics to step in and to help us in creating these standards, also for carbon credits, for example. And and the only way to do this is with multi-stakeholder management. And for that reason, I'm super excited, for example, now that we have someone at the Congress, one of the companies that was sponsoring it, Ilebau, is now paying for us to have a lobbyist in Brussels on regenerative agriculture. And for me, it's very interesting to see that lobbyism can also work on the good side. And I'm very excited to see what comes there on the policy side.
Fantastic. And it's interesting your point on the kind of the greenwashing challenges, which we're seeing in all aspects of kind of nature-based solutions. Cornelia, I know that you have the 4 per meal initiative, but would you like to maybe touch on that in relation to the question too?
Yes, I was also wanted to ask Philip if he knows about the 4 per meal initiative, because this is actually as a multi-stakeholder platform trying to encourage to increase soil carbon storage in order to increase food security, adapt and mitigate climate change. So it's actually, about regenerative agriculture, because it's very much focused on agricultural soils and, practices that may increase soil carbon. And this is actually what regenerative agriculture is about. And in the 4 per meal initiative, so we have a scientific and technical committee, and they actually worked about the definition on regenerative agriculture. So you may want to have a look at the webpage, but I agree with you. There's a lot of terms flying around in the scientific literature also, and really we have to have a definition in order to set standards and be able to implement these practices at scale. And multi-stakeholder collaboration in this regard is really important. But this should be worldwide. This should not be only focused on Europe, but I mean, there's farmers in everywhere in the world, and especially also in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. Farmers need to develop, and the development should not be towards these intensive systems that destroy soils and biodiversity, but they should take the chance to introduce more sustainable way of farming. So this is my point. Thank you.
So I just thought I would expand on what you have both been talking about. So specifically Philippe, but this idea of definitions. When you brought the farmers together and put together this manifesto, are there any high-level insights that you can share about the key beliefs around what regenerative agriculture is? Maybe those that we haven't already touched on in detail in the presentation so far.
Sure. I mean, two key learnings is definitely it's always context specific, right? Like every farm with its own ecosystem, and you cannot have one generalized do this and it will be good. That's just not the case, right? It's rather more we need to empower farmers to be the stewards of the land, and we need to help them to make the right decisions and support them in this. But in the end, a farmer knows his own soil best, and there's no one else that can tell something better than the farmer who always knows his or her land the best. And this is also part of what we need to be working with. Instead of telling farmers what to do, to tell them to start look or to help them to start looking at the land and to understand how they can increase their soil health. And this is the other part. In the end, regenerative agriculture, the easiest definition there is it's about creating instead of destroying life. That's it. That's it. If you're building up soil health, then you're also building up biodiversity, and then you're also storing carbon in the soil. And in the end, it's all about focusing on building up that soil health and looking at those millions of microorganisms which are living below our feet and helping them thrive.
Thank you.
If I may add something, so it's also the other way around. You need to install biodiversity in order to create the soil life and have really these things happening that can happen in the soil, in a healthy soil, and this will lead to our healthy food production. So it's both ways, I think.
Yeah, no,
but I agree that farmers they are stewards of the land, and they know, and they do not want to destroy their soils. They are really, as at least in France and in Europe in general, they can't do otherwise because they have debts, and they are in this system, in this intensive agricultural production system where they have to sell their products as really at a low price, and this is really also the mindset of the society that has to change, because we have to pay the price to get food that is healthy, and that comes from healthy land and is not destroying our environment.
Thanks for that, Cornelia. One of the questions in the chat. Have we seen large businesses such as Cargill looking at regenerative agriculture, and do we know what they're doing? PJ, do you want to take that one?
Yes, I think it's probably not for us here to comment on specific companies. I mean, but it is fair to say that a lot of the big agricultural commodity companies like Cargill, like Nestle, they have made commitments to regenerative agriculture. They are working on regenerative agriculture. But I make the same point I made before. That doesn't necessarily mean the work they're doing is directly helping biodiversity. There are still different approaches being applied to that. But yes, a number of companies are. But I think the sooner that we get a common definition, or even possibly a standard at some stage about what do we really mean by this, then we can judge what companies are doing and if it really is regenerative agriculture. And again, that's not passing any comment on what those sorts of companies are currently doing. And it's great to see more companies like that making those commitments. But it will be easier to determine what they're doing once we've got some common definitions. And once we have a few more examples of also measuring the outcomes that regenerative agriculture is providing, and when we see improvements in species and habitats, for example.
Just on the standards, I know from conversations with BSI that they're looking at biodiversity standards. It's a question to all of you. Do you know of any sort of pending standards with regards to regenerative agriculture that are being looked at the moment?
I mean, standards are coming already quite a few, right? There's regenerative organic label. There's land to market, which I think is my favorite, which is from the Savory Institute, which developed the EOV principle, which is ecological outcome verification, which is basically an 8-step program where farmers can even do soil tests, which they can do by themselves. Mm-hmm. And this is all indicators of regeneration. And now this has been adopted by Patagonia, which has been by far on the forefront of what has been pushing the regenerative agriculture movement there. Timberland is following suit as companies that are really to be mentioned as role models. And then I can only back up what PJ is saying. Like I see the strongest push for Region Ag right now from multinational corporations, and from some of those where, you know, in the past they were even maybe questionable, or they did not have the best image, let's say, but they are definitely pushing regenerative agriculture forward, and with big budgets and with certain interests, because they see that they don't have a future otherwise. And this is interesting about it, right? Like a lot of farmers, some of them are feeling the pressure of climate change. Some of them are seeing, oh, this will maybe not continue in the future. The big food corporates, they know. They have the analysts, they have the data, they have the information, and they can analyze it. So all of them are coming to the conclusion, in 10 years, we will not be able to operate our business anymore. We will not be able to increase shareholder value anymore. And that's driving them to look for something else. And this is very interesting because it's not what I expected when we got into this 3 years ago, but multinational corporations are definitely pushing right now the regenerative agriculture wagon forward by making public claims and also by doing stuff which they don't talk about publicly, which gave me a little bit of hope that some of those big players are realizing, if only for their own regions, that this is the way forward.
And maybe just to add to that, I think what we have got, don't forget already, there are standards and different certification schemes in place that relate to sustainable agriculture. I mean, there's a Rainforest Alliance standard on sustainable agriculture. What we haven't yet got is necessarily that link. Now, for sure, a lot of elements of that will be relevant to regenerative agriculture, but it goes back to my point about, let's be clear what we mean. If you follow somebody's standard relating to sustainable agriculture, does that count as regenerative agriculture? And do we even need that extra term? I think what's happening is regenerative agriculture is the term of the moment. It's the one being most commonly used, but I also think it's being misinterpreted too often. It sounds great, but as I say, different interpretations. Some people, it really is just ensuring that there's more carbon locked up in the soil, and that is it. But it has a lot more potential in that. And I'd like to see more elements of agroecology and sustainable agriculture sort of enshrined more formally in that. But there's a lot of stuff out there. And of course, you know, if there's a hot topic, if you've got lots of options, lots of standards, lots of tools, that kind of reflects it's a hot topic. But it does make it a challenge for some companies to know which direction to take. So what standard should I follow? Whose guidance should I follow on this? And that's why the more we can get a little bit of common agreement, the better.
Yeah, that's a good point. We always need an ISO global standard that everyone can adhere to provide alignment. I've got a question here which I'm going to put to everyone, which asks, how can we be sure regenerative farming achieves its social and environmental goals while also ensuring adequate food production? So I'm going to put that out to everyone.
Maybe I can start with the answer. I would say it's not only about it's food production. It really is not only about the quantity of the food, but also about the quality. So and in these agricultural systems where we use huge amounts of agrochemicals, there we have food that is industrially produced and not any healthy anymore, because you have a lot of pesticide residues. There may be groundwater pollution, the nutritious value of the food may not be so good, and also the taste is really completely gone. Therefore, it might be much better to use regenerative agriculture and produce maybe less food, but of better quality. Which will lead to more healthy population also. And this is really, we have to make also the connections between this regenerative agriculture and the human health in the end, over the soil health and the biodiversity. And so this has to be, this can help us also to introduce those practices more widely.
Yeah, just to add up onto that one, I fully agree. I think that there's a lot of studies which are already shown that the nutrient value is higher. And I'm happy to link or send over if someone's interested in regenerative agriculture than a conventional one. And it's crazy, the numbers, if you look at how much we have lost nutrient value in the last 50 years. Like there's like this beautiful graphic of like sowing some fruits and vegetables, and it's up to 50 times less nutritional value nowadays for some of those produce. So in the end, we eat a lot of food, and we eat a lot of really, really bad food. And one of the things that you are also seeing there, another group that's unexpectedly leading the charge for Regen Ag is chefs, and especially Michelin star restaurants. So what we're seeing from a lot of our farmers is that they are directly supplying to some of the top restaurants in the world, because they know chefs are able to appreciate the difference in the taste of a tomato, and they are acknowledging it. And this is driving it forward as well. And so this would be always a recommendation of mine. Whenever you can, if you can find a regenerative farmer around you, and we can also always help where, go there, try the food, you will never go back. Like I'm in Amsterdam for the next 5 months, and I already figured out my fruits and veggie boxes from one of our farmers. So, yeah.
Amazing. I've got a question that's come through on the chat. Which would you say are the leading countries in the world using agri-tech?
America, by landslide, unfortunately. It's very weird because they are, well, not very often a role model, but I think because their food system is so messed up, they also realized that it's not processing in the same way forward. And also because there's just so much money in the space in terms of from Silicon Valley and in big investments and so on. So almost all of the leading ag tech companies are Americans right now.
I think it might be worth pointing out, though, that high tech doesn't necessarily mean sustainable. So although technology can help here, in my experience too, I mean, technology can also often be used for intensive agriculture. So I think there are technological solutions for sustainability, but tech isn't always used for that. And I'm sure the question was meant more on the sustainability angle. And I wouldn't disagree that the US must be probably a big leader. I would think then Europe can't be so far behind. But yes, quite how it's used is the issue there.
And someone's asked here around the debate around more detailed soil sample carbon testing versus more scalable geospatial carbon analysis. And Cornelia, you know, I'd love to ask your thoughts on both of these routes.
Yes, also in the end, we have to get away from this detailed sampling, soil sampling approach, because it takes time, it takes money, and it's really quite labor intensive, and you have to collect a lot of data which you have to exploit afterwards and things, and so this is quite intensive. But we have the problem that the soil is really very heterogeneous, and regional approaches for soil testing in terms of carbon are not so adequate. And so this should nowadays, as people are working on the monitoring and the MRV schemes for soil carbon, and especially the monitoring, and they're developing methods where you use some soil testing, some modeling, and you also need statistical sampling approaches in order to be able to create these digital maps in order to map your soil carbon. But in the end, we have to upscale and to use satellites and information about the vegetation in order to look at the soil carbon. But for the moment, there's not so. The system is not really developed yet, and so we need the soil sampling for now, I would say.
Thank you.
So I was hoping to expand on this aspect of the soil carbon, and I was wondering if you could speak, or anyone could speak a little to the permanence, or how long we can actually expect the carbon to stay in the soil, and if there are maybe differences between different types of regenerative practices that might lead to the carbon actually being locked away.
Yeah, this is, I can maybe start. This is one of the problems, that the soil can be the source or the sink of CO2, and that the soil carbon storage is mostly not permanent, at least not if you use plant-derived carbon or biomass-derived carbon. When you put biochar in the soil, then it's different. Then this will really stay for hundreds or thousands of years. But when you use regenerative agricultural practices, then these practices have to be maintained. And otherwise, the carbon will go again to the atmosphere, and therefore, yeah, this is permanent as long as the practices are permanent. But in terms of sustainability, I think it's rather an advantage because, yeah, you have to use the sustainable practices all the time, forever. So this is what I have to say with regards to sustainability.
That's a great point. Because ultimately the biodiversity benefit, the social benefit, that requires the continued use. So maybe carbon, it could reverse, but for all the other benefits, we need to keep it up.
Yeah, I think so.
And to add to that, after farmers have transitioned towards regenerative agriculture, the fallback rate is very low. So the difficult period is always these first 3 to 5 years, where they basically need to build up soil health from scratch, where they will have less produce and where they will have less profit. But it already has been shown, once you have generated this healthy ecosystem, once you have the healthy soil, no farmer in the right mind would go back, oh, let's destroy it all and plow over it again. So that risk is very low the longer the time passes. And that's why we need to give them a lot of support. Also, for example, through the carbon credits in the early years where they have these risks in order to make up for that. And then I'm very confident that we will be able to establish this in the long run. And also the more and more role models we are getting of farms which have been doing this basically successfully, the easier it will be to convince other farmers. So I really think we are now there at the very difficult early times, but the more we have and the further we are going into the future, the more people will realize that this is basically the way forward for many reasons. And also storing carbon.
Thanks, Philippe. I think we have time probably for one more question, and I'm gonna ask PJ, looking at biodiversity, so similar to the carbon question, you know, using artificial intelligence, geospatial data versus on-the-ground surveys, and you know, what are your thoughts on, you know, what we should be looking at? What's the balance of the mix between the two of those? And yeah, we'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a pertinent question because I think it's not just true of the business sector; it's also true of conservation agencies now. Because of the rapid advancement in technology for monitoring, a lot more can be done remotely now. So in the old days, the only way of collecting data was to go out, take soil samples, take water samples, send people into forests with binoculars to go and count things. And so that, but of course, what we've seen in the last few years, we've seen for a start, a big growth in satellite-based remote sensing, and satellite data is now a lot more easily available at higher resolution for cheaper prices or even free. And so it's a lot easier now. And I think it's a lot more realistic to expect satellite-based remote sensing data to help provide measures of like habitat cover, natural habitat, or other land uses. So that's the biggest advancement. In terms of on-the-ground sensors, though, there's also been a huge upsurge in sensors. I mean, camera traps were probably like the first generation of tech on the ground, if you like. So where you can set a camera to record whatever wildlife passes by. But we've now seen an expansion in also acoustic monitoring, where people can actually set recordings and listen to what's out there. Another tool that we're seeing increasingly used now is environmental DNA, where people take samples of soil or water and go away and in the lab can work out what species we've seen in that area over the last period of time. And I think what we're getting to, now we're not there yet in terms of being totally automated. We're still needing quite a lot of time and sometimes resources to process those images. But we're also seeing a big expansion in artificial intelligence that is starting to do that for camera images and acoustic recording. But I think, in all honesty, what we're also seeing on this line is more interactive databases. So you've got some of these online platforms where people can actually collect data and immediately load it up. A good example is eBird, where people can log in their sighting of a bird, it immediately goes into a global database. And in fact, we have been looking with different companies about which of these tools is most appropriate for their context. And I would envisage going forward, I think in the agricultural context, I think we'll definitely see the use of satellite data to look at land use change and habitat cover. But I also think on certain farms, certainly bigger farms with strong biodiversity ambitions, we can also expect to see the use of some of these other technologies, people loading data into these global databases themselves, or using sensors for cameras or acoustics. It's quite an exciting time, but I think we're not quite there yet that everybody can just get this data at the press of a button, but it's, you know, a few years off, we might be closer to that.
Amazing. Thank you for answering that, PJ, and you know, thank you again, you know, Cornelia, PJ, and Philippe for your time and for really insightful presentations, and also thank you to everyone for their questions. And it's been an absolute pleasure, and grateful for your time. And yeah, we have to wrap things up, sadly, but look forward to catching up with you all separately after the event.